So how are you?
Fine. We're all fine. My son's tested positive, but we're all fine.
Yeah.
So
Mm,
he has no symptoms really, nothing obvious. He's a bit tired, but I can't tell being 18. So
mm,
I got the PCR results back. They were done on Tuesday.
mm.
We're negative. He's positive. He's been positive for lateral flow with no real precautions, trying to get him not to shout at us and just really wash his hands more. But
David, you have got lots of packages on your right side.
yeah,
Um,
try and move that. Trying to think, actually, maybe the other way to do it. There is another way to do it.
so you cannot move the chair a bit on the right. No.
Well, I can. I'm just thinking about. I think I can flip it. I can use a filter as well if we have to.
I mean,
But
I can crop it later.
Well, no, I think there's a way where you, because it gave me that option a minute ago on the camera.
Because I can see your Amazon.
Yeah, well, it's the present from my wife. As long as you don't tell her, we're both safe. Window. Let me. I know I can move it, so I can do things like this.
Yeah, I think
So
that. Yeah.
I don't know if that's enough, but there was one where I could flip it. It's really funny. It hasn't given me that now, but I had the option to flip it vertically. Okay, what we'll do something simple.
Because we'll do some serious talk so that no audience doesn't get
Isn't
distracted.
wondering what's in the box. That could be a whole new podcast for you. What's in the box? We could discuss that.
Yeah,
I get a bit closer, and then the audience have to guess what's in the box.
yeah. I mean, we can like open it at the end.
Yeah, at the end. No, but they don't know. No, they
No.
have to pay. They have to pay the subscription.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
That's our Dragon's Den idea.
So I'll start with like, because I mean, the whole podcast will be, the things happening right now.
Yeah, I'm fine with whatever you want. You know that.
So
I'm always happy with whatever you do, and I'll talk carefully, and I'll make sure I qualify everything.
yeah, because I mean, you're such a good talker, so it will just flow.
You should see my family. I was the serious scientific one in the family.
Oh my
So you can
God.
imagine what my brother and sister were like. But we're from Liverpool, so
Like,
we could talk about that forever.
mm,
So do you want to? So you just tell me when you want to start recording, and I'll just go through.
okay,
Whenever you want.
so the plan is like, I think the first question will be in our, the topic issue
Yeah, whatever you want. You know
dealing
that.
with. So the first question would be like, no, like if an alien comes to the planet and has got no idea about this planet and asks people what's been going on. So what would be your summary for last more than 2 years summary of pandemic?
I think what you've seen is something that's happened in human societies since we moved into cities and communities, the outbreak of an infectious disease, but dealt with in a modern society with all the advantages that it has from healthcare, from information gathering, from basically having resources to deal with it, to all the negatives which go along with the idea that we have more international travel because it spreads quicker. We have travel within societies. We have a great deal of social mixing outside family units or even specific locations like work or leisure or entertainment. And what we've seen basically is the impact on that on governments that aren't set up to deal with the sudden pandemic and its effect on the wider population. And I guess you could also say that there is a difference this time round in that the responsibility to have the tools and develop the tools to deal with the pandemic were there or on the horizon, which also gave government options. I think if you'd had no option, you've seen a completely different approach. I mean, the vaccine's working. So what would you say has happened in the last 2 years? It's been human societies adapting to the threat of a sudden serious disease and trying to prevent it while balancing economic concerns. I don't think there is an easy one, Abdullah. That's the thing. A soundbite for an alien. I guess it's dealing with the unknown. I think the other thing that's interesting about it, but this becomes a broader topic, is understanding scientific process, because I'm quite amazed by how few people understand science and how much opinion. And then again, I said about all the advantages we have through the dissemination of information. It's also been the dissemination of misinformation. So it's highlighted shortcomings in societies, I would say, at the same time that it showed some of the strengths. Can't give you a simple one.
That's okay. I mean, one thing my experience is, like, obviously the pandemic has been there, but also, like, there are, I think, lots of disruptions as well in terms of, the public discourse. I mean, so sometimes I feel that, oh my God, what's going on here? So why, like, so many people don't care about anything? And why there are lots of protests on the street as well. So normally we are talking about, it's a serious thing happened to this planet, and we have to think about that. We have to take things seriously from the experts, what they are talking about. It's like almost like the whole process was so disruptive.
I think that's a very interesting point, and I think I might have said this in a previous podcast, but one of the things I've kind of become a bit more aware of is the impact on society and history of infectious diseases. I mean, I know this generally. So, for instance, the ones that you teach to students is there's the plague of Justinian, which hits Constantinople, and when Rome is being sacked, impacts on the ability of the Eastern Roman Empire to come to the rescue of the Western Roman Empire. So the fall of the Roman Empire, you could argue, can be linked to it. I mean, if you go into biblical sources, you see plagues and whatever. The Black Death had a major impact, and I knew it brought, like, Wat Tyler and the Peasants' Revolt, because there weren't enough people to work. But also, I didn't really link it to the 100 Years' War, which is something that we're taught about in Britain with France, that for 50 or 60 years of that, you could argue that there was not enough people to fight each other effectively, because of the Black Death ripping through Europe and killing people. So it kind of put a pause on it. And I think what you talked about is this social upheaval is kind of interesting what comes next, because I'm always minded that the first socialist government in this country comes out of the First World War. The second socialist government, you could argue the Attlee administration, that really comes out the second. I think the first one was a coalition with the Lib Dems, but even so, that there was a Labour Party and Keir Hardie comes out of that. And I think then what happens now, and obviously we've got these technological revolutions which have impacted different societies. So this idea, what we're doing now, the idea that you have the power to publish and communicate, I think is really interesting. The other thing that I like about what you're doing, I'm being a bit sycophantic, but I do think the problem has been vacating space to the more extreme views, to the people who want to go out there and have agendas, right? Whereas the discussive, I don't know, is that a right word? This kind of open-ended discussions with people, I think what's encouraging is that people are doing that. And we are making connections in that way. So what comes out of it, all that disruption, I think there are lots of positives, both for healthcare, but also for how we interact and do things. I mean, our relationship, you could argue, is closer because we see each other normally on picket lines or meetings. But, because it's an interesting topic to discuss, and I think maybe forums and things like that are something that's really important. And you talked about science and understanding it. And I think that's also been interesting to me, because I think there is a deeper issue and quite a dark issue that's come up in the last few days with comments about not trusting scientists or the problem with scientists and all this and not understanding the science process. And I think that's going to be something around scapegoating, because those discussions have already happened in my society. Over 8 weeks ago, I was at our society's general meeting, and one of the informal discussions was, how are we going to deal with the inquiries? Because the move is to blame people. I think the other thing is, if science says a government has performed badly or a public policy has failed, you have to really discredit that source. Just like papers discredit judges, so that if judges give an abstract or objective view, whichever way you want to say, be objective, wouldn't it? You have to actually start to damage them in advance of anything that could come up that could actually implicate you in making a bad decision or have political consequences. So that's the thing that's happening, which I think is quite interesting. And then understanding how people process information and how poorly educated they are, because you see that on Twitter a lot. And I was listening to a talk show host talking to someone who made some valid points, because Omicron is complex, but one of the things is we've got monoclonal, we've got antibodies now. You've got antibodies, yes, but you're dealing with a variant which has antibody escape, so you have to develop them again, which should be quicker if you're making them in a laboratory and monoclonal, but you still don't have them at the scale you did for the other variants available immediately, unless they cross-react really well. And again, I've seen no data to say that they're that effective. So they say something thinking they understand something, certainty. And I don't think that's any different about science than it is for economics, than it is for social justice, than it is for, I'm not going to go into the trans debate or the feminist debate. But again, there's so many different levels to that. I'm always learning about that. And people just speak with certainty about something. And I think that general soundbite approach has been quite a shock to me when it's applied to something like the infectious disease pandemic we have at the moment.
I mean, that's my understanding as well, because I mean, the people, I think the mass always want quick fix. I mean, there's no quick fix. And especially like events like this, it's like unfolding every day. It's a live event. Do you think people are unkind to the experts, to the scientists?
I think because they don't understand the process. So I think what I kind of thought of, I think there were three things I came up with. One is people don't like dealing with complexity because it is hard. I think they like a simple message and a simple answer. And to be fair, we do try and communicate in that way because it's the only way to message things through, right? If you nuance it too much, it requires, so simplicity and that idea about not dealing with complexity often go alongside, and you can put into that the education mix. The third thing, I think, which is probably linked with simplicity, but I don't know, I think it probably sits separate, is control. People like to feel in control of their lives. They like to think that they understand what's happening, that they know what's going to happen in the future, and that they have that degree, even if it's something that is an illusion that they put at the back of the mind. And what happens with this is that they don't have control. And so that's why they want to go back to simple statements and simple answers. So you talked about the lack of respect. I think what worries me slightly is it really does show a difference in different societies and different approaches to respect. And I talk about scientists, but you could have it to any sort of expert that you talk to. Experts get things wrong. They're just more likely to get things right. Experts might not give you a simple answer. I think maybe the best illustration of that is worst case scenarios. They're all saying, well, they haven't hit the worst case scenario. Well, that's the point. The worst case scenario is assuming the worst. Every single thing can go wrong. Like the best case scenario is everything. And any sort of projection you have is in between, but they kind of give you extremes. I mean, we're in a pension dispute at the moment, and I think one of the things that is a problem for us as a union is the deficit is talked about in the sense of how it would deal with an extreme event. And you don't envisage an extreme event happening, but that's why they talk about all the universities or a number going bust in one go, and then we'd have to pay everybody out for this amount of time. And that, it doesn't really transfer into reality, because if all those circumstances came along, you'd assume inflation, you would assume maybe civil war, you maybe assume instability. You're not going to get a pension anyway. And so the idea about looking at worst case scenarios and best case scenarios and then poo-pooing one or the other, it just shows that they don't understand the process. You're trying to set the extremes of what you're looking at. And I think that lack of respect I think the problem about that is that's one of the simple messages. Oh, the scientists are to blame. Oh, the scientists are more, because you can go back and give a simple thing. And then at the same time, note the people who are doing this quite often claim they were right all along, or they're saving Christmas, or they're doing something else. So it's quite a way of manipulating information. And so blaming people, and we've seen it with race, we've seen it with religion, we've seen it with sex, anything that you can actually blame somebody, or socioeconomic things or behavior, he's a druggie or he's an alcoholic. You can deal with that information simply. And I think the sad part about that for me sometimes is I think it makes that person feel better. Either feels that they're empowered because they understand it, or I sometimes think they feel that, okay, well, at least I'm better than that person. I often felt that the racism that was shown with Obama, and he wasn't a perfect president, but I think up to then, if you were a white person in a trailer park, I think you could imagine, well, at least I'm not black. And then here you have an erudite, intelligent black person leading a country. You can't tell that lie to yourself. All these things about trying to measure yourself off something, thinking that you're better or superior, or you know more about something. And that thing I said to you about being in a university and being humble and realize, like I said to you, being on the picket line teaches you how stupid you are, because somebody talks about literature, or somebody talks about economics, or somebody tells me about, I don't know, whatever they've done in whatever case. I think I haven't got a clue about that. I didn't know about that literature. And I quite enjoy that, because then there's something to learn, right? So sorry, a long-term question to say, yes, I think it's part of a broader human approach. And I think I go back to it, but I do think education is the way you deal with this. Empowering people to think critically, to come to opinions, to use multiple sources, to try and trust an expert approach, but also have your left field thought, but be able to test it and demonstrate it.
Because the problem is linked with our, socio-economic position as well, because these things affect those structure. So for some people, this is their livelihood. This is their, bread and butter. So I think it's like much more emotion involved there. So some people see it as a kind of, like a doomsday scenario. So this is the end for me, for my family, for my, well-being. And
it's hard to imagine, the other system. And to be fair, it's hard for me to imagine the stress that they're under. If their business is going under, if they've got no plans for pension or whatever, and you're all right and I'm fighting for my own way. And maybe in more capitalist societies, that's why. I do have access to Germany, and Germany is not one homogenous group of people, but there certainly was more respect for science in Germany, which I found quite odd, really, in southern Germany specifically, that you'd be invited somewhere and talked to because you were a scientist. I mean, never had that in Britain. It was kind of, they'd leave skid marks if you said you were a scientist. They'd be off so fast. But anyway.
I saw in Germany, they have got this compulsory mask. You have to wear mask in the public places.
Yeah, but you have protests the same you have here, and you have it in certain places. It's as bad, if not worse.
But also, so many things are there. I think the media is to blame in certain degrees, because, media also jumps in, like scoop news. Oh, no, this mask is not protecting anything.
Yes. So, Karen, that's the extreme argument, isn't it? You go to the extreme to say something wrong. We still try, hopefully we've got somewhere to get CO2 monitoring put in at our university. But the debate is, well, we're not going to put them in every room, and lecturers are going to be walking out when it hits 800 parts per million or this, that, and that. And I say, I'm not asking for that. I'm asking you to understand and test your ventilation, maybe in certain areas which are under dispute, or you've got passive ventilation, and just see what readings you get, and does it help you? Is there easy ways to inform and do that? So they take it to the extreme. And even now, the solution I'm hearing, which is a bit wrong to talk about, is they would lose a lot of money and put in a very, very good. It's great, but that wasn't what I was asking for. I was asking for deploying 5 or 6 in areas that were a problem. so a couple of £100 worth. But that's what happens a lot with people. And that's also about power. You talk about it, Sophie. I mean, money is power, effectively.
Yeah.
It's little PowerPoints, right? Not presentations, but you can use it to do it. And then when you're in debates, sometimes that communal, collective approach to solving problems, which doesn't always work. I think you have to have your entrepreneur, you have to have your shop owner, you have to have your scientist who pushes through a frontier. I think there's loads of ways of doing things, but that collective approach often works for complex problems more effectively because you're critically analysing what the approach is. And what the pros and cons are. But people don't like that. They like they're in a position. So it's as if the idea doesn't come from them. In my case, I think sometimes it comes from the union. That can be a problem. What I found about politics in Scotland is that if that idea comes from the union, it's not immediately poo-pooed, which I quite like. So it's fed into the process alongside management. It's not automatically ignored. Because in the end, where the information comes from doesn't matter. It's whether it's valid or not. That's all that matters. And that's going back to science and trying to go back to that idea of objective truth, which is what we try for. And we're aware that it's very hard to achieve. We're talking about mass cues. Yeah, I mean, I think...
I'll tell you my story, as an individual, how we are reacting with all those info around us. So last night, I use Twitter quite a lot, social media. Suddenly I found that in The Economist, this respectable thing, media, The Economist put something, the headline that the only mask which can protect 95% from this Omicron variant is FFP2, something like that.
Yeah, the FFP2 is not too bad. FFP3 is you have to have filter fixed. But no, it's more effective. I mean, we can talk about why that might be if you want to, but yeah, carry on with your point. Yeah.
So I've been using this this medical surgical mask, which is cheap, disposable. So it's more in terms of money, it's
I know what you mean, yeah.
Viable. But with FFP2, these are quite expensive masks, so you have to pay I think £1 at least for each mask. And these are not reusable. So basically, you have to chuck them out once you use it for 4 hours. So I was
that's how it's measured and how it's used. And it can give you some variables on that, but yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'll let you finish.
No, so just wondering, people like me who suffers from all those social anxiety
about it.
Yeah, so I was trying to buy FFP2 last night.
Well, I can I can deal with that a little bit. The first thing is every face covering has an impact. Now, the lower grade the face covering, the more likely it is that you're protecting others. Because what you're doing is if you're expelling virus, you are limiting the distance it goes, whatever level. It might go through the pores, but it will go through with less velocity, whatever. So if you have a pore face covering in 2 meetings, you're probably protecting somebody else quite effectively. When it comes to protecting you, that's when it starts to go up. It goes up anyway in contamination, but I'm saying I think that's, for my understanding of it, that's when it becomes more successful. So the FFP2, I think one of the features is they fit slightly higher. So they're not face fitted, but they fit slightly higher on the face, and they have different levels of filtration. Now, the 4 hours is basically to meet the requirement that it's still filtering 95%. But I would say, first of all, that the fit's better, the filtration system is better. So beyond 4 hours, I'm sure you get significantly better protection. So I would still have an old FFP2 on, probably, than an older, simpler face covering, because that would still protect me, right? The second thing is, you're right, there is a curious one, and it kind of, I think, without advertising, which recommended it, and I'll try and send you the link possibly at the end of this, or look it up. But they had one that could be washed a few times, which fitted into the FFP2, and you could get it for about £24, £25. Now, I haven't got that, but it is something that I was thinking about buying now. Because what I've had is a couple that have FFP2s that have come in through they're left over from research work and projects that we had around, which I used in public spaces. But I think the protection for you, I think the FFP2 is quite a good approach to it. And I think then you have to ask, why is Omicron more of a problem? And there's a couple of reasons, but two ones which affect the mask is it looks like it infects more efficiently, so you need less of it to get an infection. And that could be because the spike protein is in a shape that allows it to enter more efficiently. There's a variation, so one bit flips up and down the whole time, and it seems it flips up a bit more or for longer in the Omicron variant, which means it can bind better. It might be that it also binds to cells higher up the airway, the bronchioles, so it's establishing its infection, which can be linked with it being mild, so it doesn't have to go as deep into the lungs to cause an infection. Because the further you go, the chances of getting the same numbers further and further down, the chances reduce. But if you have to colonize further up, it's easier. So whether it's the upper respiratory tract, or whether it's even tracking down from the nose and the mouth into the upper respiratory tract, it seems to be more effective. And the other thing might be that we expel more. That's not quite clear. I haven't seen a lot of data on that, but the Delta, it was clear that there was more reproduction and there was detecting more in saliva and nasal. So you might be producing more of something, which then you need less of to get infected. And so then your mask use actually becomes a bit more important. And because of that, it also means that a space is infected for longer. Because if you had, 1,000 particles suspended of Delta, in an hour you might expect 900 to settle, but you need, 150 to get an infection. If you need 10 of the others and you've got 100 suspended after an hour or 10, you've still got an infected dose an hour or 2 hours later. So that seems to be the reason why I think they are a good idea. The better the mask, better. I'm not saying you should fit a respirator, but obviously if you had a hazmat suit and a respirator, you'd be fine. But nobody's going to go around it. So you can source them, and they're not incredibly expensive. It depends how often you go out, and even reusing them, I wouldn't be so tied up about reusing them. I mean, that's just an informal, not an expert opinion, but it's still about how they fit to the face, because they fit slightly higher and tighter on the cheeks. And also because they have the cushioning in between of the extra filter layers.
We have got 4 members in the family, so 4 people. So if you count that way, then it can be really expensive at the end.
Well, I'll send you the link for the one that's supposed to be reusable. But the other thing is, when you use it, is the other informed choice you can make, Abdullah, because if you're going out in the general environment, you don't need it. Okay. If you're going into a packed supermarket, you might want to have one for that particular trip. You're going out Christmas Eve and everybody's in the supermarket, then maybe, or everybody's going into the shop and coming out. So you can make a strategic use of it as well, if you think that. I think this was one of the things that I think came up with the self-testing by lateral flow. The argument was you tested twice a week. Well, of course, there's a gap there. And it moved to testing before you go into an event. And I tried to advocate through the union and the website and to the university, why don't we test before we teach? Because that's what I did. The few face-to-face teaching I had, I tested on the morning. I told the students I tested on the morning, that I was talking to them, that I was taking care and consideration for them when I took my mask off. You might not catch it. You could be in the 20% where the test fails. You might have started shedding in the hour or two since you tested, or if you're in the afternoon at 4 o'clock, that's all possible. But you can use a lateral flow to help you in that way, minimize the risk. And I think, again, it goes back, governments don't message because they want simple, clear messages that people follow. And people want simple, clear messages they follow. And again, that's the same with, I think, mask use. If you just go for blanket, use some sort of face covering mask, it's as effective as anything that they've got. If they suddenly tell you to get N95 and people can't afford it and this, that, and the other, it changes.
Just one pertinent question. I mean, if a state takes the responsibility to provide those masks for everyone. How much we are talking about if you talk about UK's like population?
I can't tell you. If you decided to mass produce them, I'm sure you could mass produce them at a cost.
Because
I could imagine they're a lot less than lateral flows, how often they use it. You've got to remember, this is the state that couldn't supply PPE not so long ago.
Yeah.
Things. Yeah, I think they could go with effort. I think from the state's perspective, to be fair to the state, is the economic argument is not trivial, and what they look at is what's the most cost-effective way of protecting people from infectious disease. And you see this in US health policy, because the US are big on vaccinating. They vaccinate for chickenpox, they vaccinate for other things. And that's in lieu of public health, really, because they see it as a cheap option. I don't know whether it's out there, but there's a disease called respiratory syncytial virus. It's a very, very aggressive cold, if you like. They show pictures of it where basically the child's face is covered in mucus. I mean, it's just unbelievable how it replicates. And it can be quite serious in the young. And we would not consider vaccinating for that here. But in the States, because of the size of the population, because of the limited healthcare and protecting people, there are active RSV programs. And one of my friends, who I know from when we first started in Dundee, who moved back to Boston, works on RSV. So they have a much more aggressive policy on vaccination because it's a very effective public health measure. And I think that's the good news. I mean, I said to you, there is some good news out of the pandemic. One is we can vaccinate for it, which is the first thing. The second is the different types of vaccines that have been developed, the RNA one, and to some extent the adenovirus one, although it had been done before with Ebola, it's relatively new to make these hybrid viruses as an approach to do it. So those things have been positive. Then you ask after that, what can you do? Well, testing is the most common thing to eliminate something. So they've gone for the lateral flow, the PCR. The mask wearing, I don't understand, but somehow got caught with politics here, because if you'd had universal mask wearing, you look at Southeast Asia, you look at places like that where they're used to it, and it's a very effective policy with respiratory viruses. And I don't understand why it got aligned with politics. I'm not quite sure. You know, it's a muzzle. It's my freedom not to wear a mask. I don't really, I never really understood that. I kind of understand the anti-vaxxer position more than I understand the anti-masker position, because vaccines potentially always have side effects. I'm not saying I agree with them, but there is some risk of somebody putting a needle in with you and having anaphylactic shock or a cross reaction. It's very, very rare, and it's much more common you're going to get serious disease from the particular agent you're vaccinating against from that infection. I mean, millions of times more likely. But there is a risk. By putting a mask on, there is no risk that I'm aware of.
I mean, I'm not sure. Like, I mean, if you see the historical problem with like mask, because mask is like, you know, especially in the Europe, because Europe had gone through lots of wars in the past, and mask is linked with something very sinister. You know, so you wear mask, you know, against poison gas or, you know, all those things. If you see all those First World Wars memory. So do you think that kind of, you know, the historical...
I think it's a very interesting point. I have to be careful here. I'm not saying something that's wrong, but I think I did hear something in passing about there were people who didn't want to wear masks, I think, during the Second World War. And whether that was linked with the quality of masks. I must say that I've kind of got a family connection to that, because my grandfather was mustard gassed. I think it was Ypres in Belgium, I think, but during the First World War. And my dad always told that why I had any use at all, but my grandmother used to rub goose fat into his chest and get him to swallow it. Well, he can remember his father, his grandmother doing it with him, because he had breathing issues after that. My dad was in the Second World War. He was fitted for a gas mask, and they had to go in with phosphogene, I think it was, to tell them the choking thing, and that convinced them that if there something happened, they would wear a mask. There were no poison gas attacks. But the public were issued with them and the respirators. Maybe that is sinister. You can look at the plague and you can look at plague doctors, and the masks go back a lot further than that, and outlaws. I don't know why it is. Is it conflated with the hijab? Is it conflated with the burqa? Because we've had that sort of anti-Muslim rhetoric that's been there since 9/11. I don't know where it comes from. I could certainly see in France that suddenly, where you outlaw, I know they outlawed the burqa, I think they outlawed the hijab as well, didn't they, in schools or something like that, that suddenly then how can we have a mask on? Does that undermine us? Is that why the right-wing politics is there? I don't know. I think it might have been a convenient badge. And I think somebody might have exploited it and thought they could get on top. But I think the other thing is the underplaying of the success of it in Asia, where you actually can see it has been incredibly successful and people buy into it. And I don't really get that at all. But, there's so many strange things happening. And I think that's about people trying to retain power and control. And I think desperately messaging to support their position and not caring about the consequences about whether what they're saying is true or not.
But also, I think perhaps it could be linked with, we are social animals. So it's like, mask is kind of entity.
Reading facial expression.
Yeah. I mean, one good example, so we have been teaching, wearing masks.
Oh, yeah. No, that is hard. I agree.
So we just started, doing some face-to-face teaching as well. But last 2 years, more or less, everyone is wearing masks, or on Zoom or Teams and all those platforms. This example, I was walking through university campus and I saw someone just pass by and she was smiling at me. And I thought, do I know this girl? And I actually asked her, "Hi, how are you?" And then actually I asked her, "Do I know you?" And says, "Oh, I am this. No, I'm in your class."
I guess you're right. Yeah.
So I did not recognize her. Did you see? So people are becoming unknown to us without mask. So it's other way around, did you see?
Yeah, I think what you say is really interesting, because I think for me, the hybrid teaching has also been interesting, because I don't know that I've affected my teaching as well as I thought, whether I've delivered it as well as I could have, because I thought it would be reading the room, which is kind of what I missed doing online teaching. Because students would very rarely come in, you get questions down the side and things, but it was a bit of a monologue. I'm probably better suited to a monologue than many people who deliver teaching. But I found with them all in the room with a mask on, I didn't get that much feedback. I did get the nod I want, which said that non-verbal communication from somebody. I didn't really get discussion working, and I think masks do block you speaking. I think that's an interesting. I don't think you have to take the mask off to talk. I was watching, was it Question Time, where they did that, but I kind of understand why you do take it off, not just lip reading and expression, but it's also easier breathing as somebody who's started a lecture wearing a mask and took it off just to see what the effect was. But it's quite hard to talk and breathe, and the better fitted they are, the worse that is. So that communication, I think you're right, and that recognizing people, which makes you think about how mask use, it has been used historically, to exclude people, or by people who are criminals who don't want to be recognized, whether it's the outlaws in the Wild West or the bank robber. I think it's an interest, and I think that's a social thing to consider. I also would be fascinated, because I know people got them for their language classes, but these see-through masks, how they actually worked for people, effectively at doing things. No, sorry, going back to what you said, I think you're 100% right. I think they are constricting, they aren't ideal, but I think in the face of what we talked about before, somebody whose business is shutting down, or somebody who can't get into a hospital appointment because it's full of COVID, or somebody that, I don't know, can't carry out their job in the way they want, like we do for teaching or communication the way they want to. I would have thought it was a small price to pay to wear a mask. Because it's often the same people. It's like the people who complain about immigrants or unhealthy people blocking hospitals or people who don't need A&E are the unvaccinated people who are blocking hospitals and stopping other people getting in and then complaining about online appointments. You know, it's this curious inability to think objectively or see themselves from outside or question. I think it is that questioning about your position and your behaviour. And that goes back to simplicity of message, and that goes back to your first point about understanding scientists are giving you the best scenario or the best understanding, and it changes in real time. And that's what experts do. They make a mistake and they adapt and change their model to try and overcome the mistake.
I'm getting like distracted about the actual topic area because but I mean, part of the problem is, I mean, these are social things. We really need to discuss those things. And we really need to have the understanding. So I think part of the problem is we are still in a kind of self-denial that things are. I mean, we think that things are still fine. It's not. We are going through some serious things. It's like, I'm not sure like whether you can compare this with like war, like some big war happening. And then, if there's a big war like Second World War, First World War, it disrupts society.
Yeah, no, I think economically.
And then people more or less accepted those positions that, we don't need to go to school.
Yeah.
We don't need to go to university. We just go home and then protect our family. But I mean, those like mindset is not done here. And I think that's the most difficult part.
Yeah, they want a simple over and you've crossed the line. But I mean, it's like George W. Bush, isn't it, in Iraq when he has the sign on the aircraft carrier, "We won," right? I don't know what the percentages are, but I know many more lives were lost after they won the war than during the war that they had in Iraq. And it's that idea about simplicity and comfort and control that there is an end point. I think what is fascinating, though, is what you said, is, you're comparing it with the war as an engine of social change. We could argue that our pension dispute is by taking the valuation when the markets crashed in March was an opportunity for people to, I would argue, steal the benefits and the money for their good. They could put through an agenda so they could find the worst possible time to do it to force their agenda. And I could also argue that as far as the pension thing's concerned, that, as we see coming out of the pandemic, that, lifespan will be considerably compromised, whether it's through long COVID or the people who've died or all the other issues, that probably a reevaluation of schemes will also change about judging the age at which members die, right? So you can see how that's been used, but you think about all the other social changes that come in. I talked about what we're doing. I mean, you're a desktop publisher now. You're not a film producer, but in the sense that you've got that ability potentially to reach people. And then when we think about our distance learning, when we think about how pre-records, I mean, they've always been there, but we haven't used them, right? And also that where students are educated, I don't know that we're doing it well enough because we're adapting in real time, but getting students used to self-learning and using online resources. I always used to highlight that and what's going on. I'm trying to make these virtual interactions more meaningful. I try and put links out and suggest activities they do. I would never have done that for face-to-face teaching. I don't think I've got my face-to-face teaching up and going yet because I think, like you said, masks limit it. I think it has to be a tutorial-based system, and that will be interesting to try and do. And group activities, but all that will change. And then we talked about people working from home and the implications that has for firms from coffee shops to other support services, rather moving out of the centre of a city into the suburbs, and the transport, the cost of real estate in centres of town. Because you had to be in the City of London to carry something out. What actually do you have to be there for? And that has implications for transport links, whether it's HS2. So I think you're right. I think as a social change, it's fascinating because it combines a sort of wartime footing and the debt that's being produced, like you said, although, debt to some extent is virtual. And then all those other things that change, about supply chains. And we suddenly recognize what some tanker drivers have become so important. So I think you're absolutely, I think it's fascinating what comes out of it. We won't see it. I would desperately say to anybody watching this, because I'm trying to do it and I'm really bad at this, is photograph things. I didn't go out and photograph the centre of Dundee when we were in lockdown, which would have been, because I had a key worker status for a while. And the shops all shut and the empty streets, but I should have done, right? And we're just living through it. And I know that from trying to teach and take pictures from the 1918 pandemic and finding how limited the number of, things there are. So no, I think you're, I am fascinated. I don't know what we're doing. People accepting it's a war footing, but again, people not accepting that, it will take time. And the other thing is thinking, the vaccines look really good. They keep saying eradication is impossible, but the improvement in vaccines, theoretically it is possible, but we all need to do it, whether it's patents for the third world, whether it's whatever,
That's one of those one examples where science more or less won. Basically, the more vaccination, the less death. So numbers of people are dying are much, much lower. So it's it looks like the vaccine absolute, and the people who are, not accepting that position. That's a bit, kind of worrying, because if these numbers still stay the same, 25% of the population or 30% of the population don't take it, then we'll just carry on this kind of situation much longer than we were expecting in the beginning.
Yeah, I don't know if that's hardwired. I mean, that you'll always have a percentage of people who like to feel that they're thinking contrary, that they know something secret that's going on, the conspiracy theorists, or whether it reflects education. And I would think a significant amount of that reflects education, that how to get people to critically think about things and understand things and be prepared to change their mind. I mean, I think it was QI that alerted to me this, but I loved that thing about the half-life of facts. So it was something in medical curricula, it was some ludicrous proportion. So if you are watching this, don't hold me to it, but look it up. But it was something like 50% of information that was taught to medical students within 10 years was wrong. And I think what that meant was there were adaptations or changes to it. So it might not be that it was completely wrong, but the therapy wasn't shown to be effective in all cases. It didn't fit the clinical things, or the understanding of a disease process was there was another way you could intervene or do stuff like that. But it was still remarkable that information changed. About things like the role of the appendix and things like that they're told was done nothing, and now they talk about immune sampling and things like this that go on. And so that sort of idea, or the bacteria in the gut, which is sort of an area which is linked to sort of my research interest in microbiology, that in fact it would affect mood and depression or uptake of fat. When you think about the molecules that go into your body can have an influence on the functioning of it. So if the bacteria in the gut are contributing to the molecules that go in, you can imagine how it would skew one way or the other. So the fact that you're constant, and it's trying to get people to think about that. But I think simplicity, certainty allows people to feel in control. And I think the thing, whether it's with kids or whatever you do, or your career, you learn that you're not in control, or your health, unfortunately. People learn that quite quickly, that they're never going to get ill, and then they're diagnosed with something and suddenly they need the health service. And that's been interesting about the anti-vaxxers. Somebody was tweeting today, I think it was Phil Hammond, saying he's seriously interested in how many of them who say there isn't the science for the vaccine, when they turn up in hospital seriously ill, accept the science behind the treatment or the intubation or whatever. Suddenly they believe in that, now they're ill, but before they don't believe in that, which is preventative. And that might be down to the fact that you physically have to see or hold something or do something to communicate something, and people don't deal well with abstract fact. And that goes to how we teach kids, whether it's in primary school or I think even in kindergarten, about how to deal with information and how to learn.
Mm-hmm. So like another like political question is, if you are asked to give a list of criticisms about our government, UK government, I'm focusing on just UK, what will be that list looks like? Can you give us an example, like three, top three criticisms?
I think the top one and the major one, and I think the Trump administration did this as well, was to retreat from pandemic planning, from running scenarios for the implications of an infectious virus, because it wasn't just Hollywood, it wasn't just Bill Gates talking about it. Human history, that there's been warnings about infectious diseases. And, we have global warming, my interest in antimicrobial resistance to some extent, all those things pose serious risks to people. And that the pandemic planning, my understanding was that basically Trump disbanded them and didn't update it. And we certainly didn't respond to the recommendations, whether it was about. So there was the preparedness, there was information there. And I think why that's important, whether it's global warming, there's not much you can do about being hit by an asteroid, but whether it's any of these other things, being prepared and planning and running scenarios, it's not exciting, but it's really useful. I think the second thing about that is probably, and goes into the scientific community as well, the criticism is the lack of critical thinking. There were two things that I think are generally well accepted. One is that, to begin with, they treated it like it was flu, which was the most up-to-date plans they had with flu. And you can take that back to not saying use masks straight away, right? And the idea of herd immunity. So the point about immunity is it's a really weird thing. I mean, you get less immunity from getting the infection than you do from the vaccine. And the same thing, the idea that you would reach herd immunity and protect you. I think Boris Johnson went on TV saying that. So there was no critical thinking to actually looking at what was in front of them. There was enough evidence from SARS and what had happened in the past. There was enough evidence from how countries in Southeast Asia were treating it. And I guess the degree of that thinking is exceptionalism, that you think so. So the second thing I would say is that lack of critical thinking and awareness and looking at what's in front of them. The third one, which is a difficult one to criticize because it was an unusual event. I mean, the first time they dealt with it, but to have an eye on what the press or the public think in a situation like that, or the messaging, I think it's a mistake. When you're faced with a crisis, I think you have to decide the action you want to do and sell it. And I felt too much of public policy was about how something appeared and not how effective it was. And we see that even now with we're saving Christmas, we're saving New Year. Where you could write it the other way around is we've decided enough people will die, or there won't be enough, the NHS can cope with that extra pressure, so you can go out and get drunk, or some hospitality businesses, or we can't bail out, which is my reading of the talk. So it's that look at how something is perceived rather than the crisis situation, how do I deal with it? It's that thing that if your aeroplane crashes, you're not going to think, no, what's going to be the most popular decision for all of the people here? What's the most comforting thing to say? The radio is broken. We'll all be rescued within an hour. That will play really well with the populace, but it's not the right approach, right? So you asked me about the three things. I think the lack of preparedness was highlighted and people have talked to it and stuff. The second thing was the critical thinking around those decisions. And see, Dominic Cummings took it too far. He likes to think that if you do the opposite, the counterintuitive thing can be brilliant, but the counterintuitive thing can also be bloody stupid. I mean, that's what you have to, that's where critical thinking comes in. And the third thing is playing it as a political decision when it was a crisis and you had to deal with what was happening. Right, and you could talk about that as trusty experts if you
Yeah,
like. To some
yeah. Thank you, David. I'll go for like more technical questions, like because you're the scientist here. So, like in terms of like we saw like couple of variants in the past. Like, how does it work? Like, so if you talk about like we saw like Delta variant, can they come back again, or it's gone? We can move on.
Okay, so that's a really good question. The first thing is, how do variants arise? And what you have is variation in the genetic material that makes the virus particle. Now, that can be down to the instability of the particle itself, of the molecule, or the enzymes that do it. And it can also be a numbers game, that it's random. Because if you do think about it, it's quite remarkable that this small little protein fat-covered piece of genetic material was living in a bat or surviving in a bat as a parasite, and is now one of them's up the nose of my son in the back bedroom behind this door. They've spread right across the world so quickly and just replicating. And because there's so many copies made by individual cells and so many cells get infected in so many peoples, you get variation. And then what you have is you select for any variation that gives it a better chance of making more copies of itself. So the two obvious ways of doing that is to make yourself better at getting from me into a new host. And the other one is to avoid any sort of molecules or challenges that will prevent me from carrying out that process. And what I'm talking about is your immune response. It's the cells in your body that will kill it. So they're the two things. So what you do is you tend to get these variants that circulate that give them slight advantages. And as they get out into a wider population, what you see is the most successful of them. So there'll always be a variant. It's quite common that you see in HIV patients, you see it vary during the lifetime. You'll see variants in an individual. It's probably that there's some mutations that have occurred that might be unique that have happened in Tim while he's been replicating it. And some of those will make it less effective and it'll die, or there'll be a problem with it. So variants come up the whole time, and then the most successful ones are the ones that can be passed to a new person more quickly and can overcome any immune response. And then what happens is, as they spread, people, as they recover, will have antibody subprotection for them. And it's a curious fact that depends upon the severity of the infection. It depends upon the person's immune system. And so you get less immunity from an infection than you do from being vaccinated, because the vaccines are fine-tuned to putting a large amount of one particular shape into your body that will allow your body to recognize the virus. So what you've seen is gradual changes which have overcome a little bit the vaccines. So that's allowed them to spread into populations. And then what happens with Omicron is you get quite a big change. I think it's something like 50 mutations. I think 30 of them are in the spike protein, and I think there's a part of it that's been removed. It's not easy to alter a protein and for it to retain its function. So it allows them to infect cells, to be functional, to make such a change in its appearance that your body no longer recognizes it. So it's likely that there's only a limited number of these changes. And actually, what's quite nice about that is early on in the pandemic, a group did it on a computer where they were predicting what changes would work from what they knew about the structure of it. And they identified some of I think it was the beta, and I'm not sure if it was the delta, but they predicted some of the ones that came up. This is a complete rearrangement. So it's a very, very big leap. And that's why it's overcome most of the immune responses and vaccines. What's quite amazing for me is that, but if you boost, like you boost the AZ with the Pfizer, or you have a third Pfizer, there's enough variation that you can still recognize this mutated form. I mean, that's really good news. And that certainly, I think that was a big fear back in December, that you might have to need a special vaccine, that the existing vaccines wouldn't have any significant impact on it, but it appears they do. That was a big, big plus, and why the booster program took off. So you said, well, they keep coming. Variants will keep coming. They'll keep selecting for them. How far they can change, I would imagine, and I think the evidence is there's a limited amount they can change. And as we've seen, it seems to be probably significantly less virulent, the form that we have now. But it still hasn't escaped existing vaccines. The other thing is the existing vaccines work, and they should be able to be adapted for Omicron so that you would have one. I mean, people are looking at ones where you have little bits of all the variants that have gone on, probably including the Omicron, and then trying to introduce that. And then there are other proteins, which you see in some other types of vaccines, which don't change as much, which you could also add to the mix, and you might get almost 100% effective vaccine. And then you start to talk about whether you can eradicate it or not, and it might be possible. But I think those tools, I mean, it's been incredibly fast for science now, but those tools look like they're 6 to 9 months away, which is a short period of time, but has an impact, obviously, on us as a society. So you asked if variants will come up. They will come up. It's taken a long time, a lot of infections for Omicron to appear. How much more Omicron can change will be the interesting one. But the fact that even with that massive change, a booster still works is quite encouraging. It might mean that we need a 4th or a 5th booster, but it's still, there's still some control. And remember, antivirals are coming along as well at the same time, which will help with serious disease.
Like more like practical question, because I mean, you told us that your son has got COVID now. Like if someone has got COVID now, how easy to detect that? What kind of variant it is?
Well, the variant, it requires PCR. The lateral flow still works because the lateral flow doesn't detect the spike protein; it detects the envelope protein, but it's not as effective. So you wouldn't use it as a diagnostic tool. You wouldn't use it in a hospital, but you would use it in society because it captures maybe 80%. And also, so there's 2 kits on the market now, and the second kit looks like it might even be a bit more sensitive. So you can detect that you've got a coronavirus and it's likely to be SARS-CoV-2. I've had a no cross-reaction because they tested all the cross-reaction with other coronaviruses, so it will be SARS-CoV-2. And then what variant you've got, the PCR, it can be effective because the changes are so much that you don't detect the spike protein by PCR. You detect all the other proteins, which tells you it's SARS-CoV-2 by PCR, but you don't detect the spike. So it's sometimes referred to as a spike dropout because it's failed to detect the spike. But because all the other bits are positive, they know that's it. And then to get absolute certain things, you have to sequence the whole viral genome, which isn't as difficult as you might think, but is only done on a subset of samples. And that's how Omicron was detected in the first place. So the surveillance that's done, and it's very good in the UK, and in Africa, it's one of the best places is South Africa. So that's how you take. So PCR will tell you if it's Omicron or not.
Okay. Like another practical question is, I still remember like when my colleague Carlo got coronavirus in the very beginning of this pandemic, he was basically locked in a house, like, stay there, you'll be, supplied food and everything. So you cannot get out from your room. So if someone has got coronavirus now with all those vaccination and everything done, what kind of regime we are looking here? Still will lock them down?
Well, I mean, we're isolating at the moment. And what I do, which is probably wrong to admit, but I will walk the dog if I've got a negative lateral flow, but that's straight onto the hill. But apart from that, I don't go out. And we obviously don't talk to anybody and we avoid anybody. You would argue that I shouldn't go out at all. But I do a lateral flow before I go out. And like I said, it's outdoors, avoiding people, not shops or things. But I think strictly the rules are you should isolate completely. I made the decision early on not to have the dog walker come to the house because I thought it was more risk of transmitting it to him. You should be isolating, distancing, getting things delivered. Within the house, we haven't employed masks or anything or isolated Tim in any way. No, I know people who have done that. The reason we haven't done that is because we've both been boosted beyond 14 days, so we have the best protection that we can have as parents. My younger son is double jabbed with AZ and might still have some reactivity because it would finish in September. And if it's Omicron, I think it's almost impossible, don't quote me on it, to stop us catching it, really. There was evidence people with Delta, and certainly with the first coronaviruses, that the isolation regime would work, that they would wear a mask, that they would eat separately, that they wouldn't produce aerosols. So you can down that route. And certainly if we were susceptible, if you had somebody in the house who was susceptible and couldn't move somewhere and safe, trying to isolate them and put in protection measures, yes, you would obviously do that. You know what I mean? That you would make sure they wouldn't go into the room, they wouldn't come into contact, they would wear a mask. But we have that situation where we should be as protected as we can be. We're talking at the stage I'm at now, it's about day 3 since he tested positive, and he continues to test positive. We all continue to test negative, and that includes a PCR on day 2, which you wouldn't expect. You'd expect with Omicron that it would come up quicker. Tim came up quite slow. He doesn't really have any significant symptoms. I think that also might be linked with spread of diseases, that people with Omicron are walking around, and if they're not self-testing and they're not wearing masks, they're being very effective at super spreaders without knowing they've got it. And it might be that mildness that is also contributing to the doubling rate. So you asked what to do. I think it depends upon your situation. You certainly can do it, and I would certainly say if you're worried or you're at risk, you can do it. It's all the basic things about ventilation, about when you're thinking about eating, drinking separately. If you can dedicate a bathroom to somebody, especially brushing teeth and creating aerosols, sneezing, hand hygiene, you can do that. But I think in many circumstances, it might be that you just take a more pragmatic approach, that you're either going to get it and recover, or you're significantly immune boosted, that you're not going to catch it because of the vaccines.
We spend quite a bit of time because I have to go outside to take my daughter to her dentist. So I will finish like in 15, 20 minutes time. Another question will be, like, I mean, what's beyond this Omicron? I mean, what kind of scenario we are looking here?
It's hard to predict. Omicron is a big difference. A big difference, as I said before. You might get variants on that, like the alpha, beta, gamma. You might get another massive rearrangement. You just can't say. The issue is how much can the virus change and retain its ability to replicate in human cells. And it looks like it can't change too much in the sense that our antibodies are still recognizing, okay, they require boosting, okay, you have to make more, they go down quicker against this variant, but there still seems to be some protection, and that's the argument about serious disease and hospitalization. It also appears that it is milder. I mean, I don't agree with the UK government's approach, but it's not madness. They're not crazy people. They are sort of gambling on this idea that they can somehow ride out the wave, maybe through the natural isolation that's occurring and the sort of semi-shutdown that we're going through Christmas, and try and flatten the number of cases. But it does appear there's enough studies now to suggest that it's not causing as many hospitalizations, and certainly the hope is less deaths. There seem to be different age groups that we worry about and different conditions. So under 5s or something people are concerned about. People with blood cancer is also another thing where there's been some sort of spike. So we don't really want it in hospitals, and we don't really want it in maternity units or nurseries or whatever, where it could actually do significant damage. So that's one of the things that comes up in the question. So where will we end up? I think better tools regarding vaccination, I think they're on the horizon because the vaccine development never stopped. And mixing and matching, possibly even live viruses. There was an interesting Scottish-French firm that some funding pulled out, the Scottish one had gone in, which is working on a live virus. The Chinese live viruses haven't been that great at attenuating. They come with their own risks. But then there's these multi-component RNA viruses and multi-component protein-only vaccines that are all on the horizon that there's promising results. So I think the tools are there. There are tools, they're expensive at the moment, the supply will increase and they'll become cheaper, but there are antiviral drugs that could be used in hospital settings. I mean, they talk about used in the general population. It's much more likely that you would restrict them to hospital settings because it will be controlling critical disease. Antivirals in the general population are difficult to use, so I can't see that happening. And because every time you use it, you select for failure because you select for developing resistance to them, just like they do for antibiotics. So, but they certainly think then that could be outcomes and clinical management could be helped. So the tools are there, and you can vaccinate against it, and theoretically it can't change. There are disaster scenarios. There's always disaster scenarios. Probably the one that is, if you want to have sleepless nights, is it recombines with the flu virus, and that you get some sort of hybrid virus which has various things. Now, even in that approach, you still got drugs that are being developed, you still got vaccines, but that could not go back to square one, but could send you significantly back. But there's no evidence at the moment, and one of the good things about the pandemic has been some of the measures have stopped flu circulating for a while. So. But generally, I think you're in a better place. I just think people expected it to go quite quickly without any setbacks. It could be that this is the last one. I wouldn't expect more than one more before we actually start to get these really good multi-component vaccines coming up. So, yeah.
Because I still remember, like, when we talked last time, I asked, like, similar question, like, I mean, when this will end, what kind of, prediction you could do. And you mentioned that, I mean, it's like more kind of positive note that by summer 2022, we might see it, is eased up. That's for the first world. But for the third world, it will be difficult. They will take more time, more years. Do you still stick to that position, or do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm summer to autumn, but I mean, again, I'm being optimistic, but like I said, the big thing is that the booster worked. I mean, that's a bit of a surprise to me. And the combination of vaccines works so well against the Omicron because it's such a big change, as shown by its ability to infect people who've had all the other types of the virus. That's positive as well as vaccines. And I tried to put that out in some of the tweets we have because I think people think it goes on forever and we have to live with it. We might have to live with it and it might be, but it's not certain that we have to. It could be something that completely removes. The other thing is, if you want to be depressive, another virus can come along, an asteroid can hit you. You see, we deal with these challenges. And I think what you talked about before, the biggest societal change, it'd be interesting to see how that plays out.
But there's like funny story, like, I mean, Hollywood has just made a new film. So the film is about actually asteroid. So the experts are saying that this particular asteroid will actually hit the planet. And this is the end. And then people actually, were divided in the planet that no, they are not right. So like 50% of the population, no, it's not going to happen. Do you think that the world will be always like that? Even, the experts are certain that, this is going to happen and we have to be ready. But people say that, no, we don't care.
I think it goes back to the nature of being a human being, doesn't it? I think I always think you break it down. There's part of being this super colony, which is the human race, and that's sort of that your individual perception. And I always think that even that friction between socialism and capitalism is like that, the individual versus the organization and the power of the group. And I don't think you ever get away from that. And certainly as an individual, how you deal with reality is linked very much both with your education, your outlook, but also maintaining your mental health. That's why you have confirmation bias. That's why you have what's called cognitive dissonance. I mean, that's always fascinating to see. And I'm not saying religion is wrong, but part of the thing that drives religion or cults, and I'm not saying religion is necessarily a cult, or political beliefs or ideologies, is that idea that you have something that makes sense to you and becomes a bigger part of your personality. You know, how much of your personality is vicarious is how other people see you and how other people agree or disagree with your views. I'm against this or I'm for that. So I think you'll always have a way of dealing with things, and some of it will be denial. And, you know, I do denial. I lost both my parents in the last 2 years. They were elderly. It was natural and whatever. But I'll go and talk to them in my head, and I'm not a particularly religious person that believes they're there, apart from they're in my memories and what I do. And it goes, so the degree of denial sometimes is how we get through. So I think you'll always have populations separating in that way. I don't mind that approach because I think you've almost got to be schizophrenic. There's part of it that is about you as a person and how you deal with the world and your friends and your enjoyment and how you grow. And then there's a sort of rational, logical, broken down side. And, you know, that's that compromise you have to make. And so I think, yes, we'll always have that people will deny the asteroid. And the point is, if it misses, they'll say, I'll show you I was right. There's a whole history of that with infectious disease. There's a guy in the 19th century who says, bacteria, pathogens, they don't cause disease. So he makes Schizoplast of Vibrio cholera and says, I'll prove it to his class, throws it around and drinks the Vibrio cholera, right? And he's completely healthy. He doesn't get cholera. And because he was immune to it. He must have had cholera in the past and it didn't colonize his gut and he was fine. And there you go. Somebody else had taken it, they might have died of it. But he did the experiment on himself and he believed it and reinforced it. So, you know, people's view of things and their world, I don't think we can deal with that. I think I go back to the Greeks and I go back to science and I go back to the idea of testable hypotheses and the idea that you can come up with some objective truths within the confines of how you define what you're dealing with. But there's always mysteries, and that's why I also wouldn't be as negative as Dawkins is on religion and things like that. You know, the nature of reality, the nature of our own existence is something that we take on an act of faith. Yeah. So it's a long philosophical reply to say, I think we'll always be split, but what we have to do is educate people to understand how to organize information and to be aware of complexity. You don't have to deal with it. You know, a lot of the teaching I do, I teach them things that they're not tested on. I said, but you should be aware where this information came from, where you go to look at it, that I'm qualifying, that I am lying to you. I mean, that's almost the first thing I say to my medics and dentists in first year. You know, you've come to a school now, you have to be aware I'm going to lie to you. I'm going to give you a simple story that helps you work, that goes through clinical problems and whatever, but it's not, you know, the definitive story or why things are. We can talk about the edges of it, but really they only affect one or two patients you might see in your career. But if you can recognize the thing that doesn't fit the pattern, those one or two patients, you could save their life because they don't fit the pattern. You know, they've got something underlying. So that's the idea about being aware that I am believing in something, I'm taking something on face value, but I'll go back and reevaluate and I'll be prepared to change if I have to.
That's very profound. That's, I think,
it's not my own fault.
Yeah, like, I mean, normally, you know, so scientists don't talk like that. You know, do you think some scientists are arrogant?
But science it's a label. It's like saying all socialists believe in this or all conservatives are complete bastards. The point is they're human beings, and the science is a way of organizing thoughts and ideas. You know, I know people who are molecular biologists who don't believe in evolution, which I find completely crazy, but somehow they park it in the experimental system that they work on and do the work and enjoy it and understanding it. But they've compartmentalized their life, that doesn't stop with this idea about creation or whatever. And you know, you can find every type of view. I think that it's about the communication of science, but that's again about people don't have time for it. They want simplicity. And I think that's where your natural history's been really good, because your natural history shows you complexity, but then history does that, right? I mean, you see people digging up things and suddenly they discover that, you know, the Romans weren't here, or this didn't happen the way I thought, or this person that was peripheral to history was incredibly important. So, I think it's about communication, but your audience and the time you have to do it and how you do it. If you want me to say something profound, I think that I actually found philosophy and religion quite interesting from that perspective, being taught it at school, because it was about ideas and belief. And that is kind of linked, you know, to how you organize your mind and science. And being aware, you know, if you're just taught that there's one religion and there's nothing else, how do you know, it's quite interesting what do Jewish people believe? What do Muslims, because I brought up a Methodist, what do they believe? You know, that's interesting. And then Buddhism, so Buddhism's older, but then he comes, and then Hindu, they have all these different gods and things. But it's interesting how things are organized and thought through, right? And then that has cultural implications, whether it's what you eat, whether it's how you organize your year or your day or your relationships. You know, I mean, and then that's the world you look around you. You know, they always worry about this idea that somehow this Christian Anglo-Saxon culture is under threat. I mean, so much from the law courts to everything, you go back to Romans and Judeo-Christian tradition, that's embedded in this country, right? And what you see is all these variations coming in now and other things come in, which I find fascinating. So I don't think you have the time to communicate it. I loved listening to somebody talking about the French and the amount of philosophy and stuff that's taught at school, which is wonderful. The number of French philosophers there are and thinking about things. And this is kind of, if anybody's watching who's a molecular biologist, they'll get this probably more than you will, Abdullah. But I remember years ago, one of my friends came from the Pasteur in Paris, which is a nice scientific institute, working on bacteria, and there's a group of genes which control lactose metabolism, which are quite famous because they were studied in bacteria, and they showed how one gene was linked to the protein and the production and switching it on and off and making it when you needed it, right? These enzymes for breaking down lactases and stuff like that. So because it was showing how genetic material and proteins worked, and though we had a student from the philosophy department in the lab. So to molecular biology, they had somebody from philosophy. They were doing the philosophy of the lac operon. So they were looking at gene regulation and trying to come up with a philosophical. And I just thought that's mad, but wonderful at the same time. You know what I mean? That cross-fertilization. So when you say I talk like this, and all scientists talk like that, nobody's the same, you know. And that's the same whether it's culture, whether it's your discipline or whatever. Science is trying to get to, for me, the definition is the Greek, it's trying to get to objective truth, basically through reproductive experimentation and the testing of hypotheses. That would be my definition, right? And that's trying to inform how you carry out actions and how you understand the world around you. And what I love about the natural history programs is they have scientific basis, but that complexity of all these interactions and all these different things, I think it's amazing.
Like one final question is, it's like political question, because I've been thinking about this for some time, and I asked other colleagues as well. Everyone has got their own kind of idea. And like Jeremy Corbyn has got his idea. So the people who are not vaccinated, and basically, are told that you cannot work in a care home situation, or you cannot work in like hospital. If you want to work in the hospital, you have to be vaccinated. What's your take on that? Can you be kind to those people who don't want to be vaccinated, but at the same time work for those hospital settings?
So the compulsory vaccination story has a historical precedent, which is smallpox, because smallpox was effectively compulsory in the UK in the 19th century. Apparently, you could object to it, and you could take it to court, but the only people who could stop somebody getting vaccinated, not getting a childhood vaccination in court, really required legal representation. So it was priced out of most people's ability. In France, I think it was as late as 1970 that smallpox was compulsory. The people have used vaccination to control disease. Then the question is, does my individual freedom impact on the individual freedom of somebody else? And that's, I think, probably the moral question that you have to do. And if your freedom not to have a vaccine and work in a place where you affect the individual freedom of somebody else, their ability to survive, to live, I then think you can be restricted from that activity. In the same way that I don't think my individual right to, I don't like masks, but I want to be a surgeon. I mean, it's a pretty crap metaphor, but I don't think you should be a surgeon if you're not prepared to mask because your patients will die. I guess if you want to get into a grey area, you could have a whole community of anti-vax people living in a care home with anti-vax carers. If you want that sort of approach. I mean, in a country like America, probably that's possible and you can do it. But I don't think you can put it into a state system where people don't have choice about being cared for by people who are vaccinated because of the risk it poses. So I think you have to have that. And that's because it's a life or death and the implications for the state and for the individual. It's like it's my individual, I don't know. Can't think of other metaphors, but if you have some other infectious disease to do what the hell you like, you would be restricted when you'd have symptoms. But you can go back to Typhoid Mary. They tried to explain to Typhoid Mary that she was shedding. Again, it goes back to sort of Vibrio cholera, and she wouldn't have it. And so she went back. She didn't get as much money as a cleaner as a cook, so she went back to cooking. And there's Typhoid John, who I think actually kills more. And she was restricted from working as a cook. Mary Malone, she was from Northern Ireland. And there's a great picture of her, which is, so eventually the state of New York had no other option because they had very legal things. They had to certify her as insane. So that was the only way they could stop her changing her name and cooking for people because she didn't believe in Vibrio cholera. So they certified her insane, and there's a picture of her in an insane asylum looking into the camera like, fucking hell, why have they put me in a madhouse? Now, I think she was incarcerated the rest of her life, or certainly significantly part of it, 10, 20 years. So she was rendered insane to stop her practicing. So I don't think you have the right to deny vaccination and the protection of individuals if you put those individuals' freedom to live at risk.
Thank you, David. I mean, you cleared so many things today for me. Thank you so much. You have an absolute pleasure.
It's fascinating what you're doing, and I think producing these. I think the other thing you've got to remember, Abdullah, is the sort of historical documents as well. Because you said you talked to me earlier, and I said, "Oh, I think we could get through it, and I could be proved wrong." And certainly, people could look at this and think, "Oh, he was completely wrong about that or the other." And I think that's one of the things. There's a bit of an archive element of this, and don't underestimate that. Because these conversations aren't recorded in the same way.
Yeah. Because I mean, with me, like, these are historical documents, what we are doing here.
Yeah, but your responses as well. And I think the other thing what you've got to understand is you bring as much, if not more, to this because you're asking the questions or trying to understand in the way of what's pertinent to you. And actually, it's a much more effective way if you're not an expert and you don't understand something. And also, we talk as friends. So you can turn around and say, that's crap. Why are you saying that? Do you know what I mean? And I think that as a historical document is really interesting because what were people thinking during the 1918 flu pandemic? How were people dealing with it? Did they think it would ever go away? It's fascinating. I saw also another picture, which was the 1930s Arsenal team gargling with mouthwash to stop themselves getting flu because they were worried about flu in the season so they could play more games. At the moment, we've got this COVID issue with Premiership footballers, and they're, 80 years ago, they're trying mouthwashes because they're worried about getting ill and not being able to play in the team because of just seasonal flu. So, the parallels, we keep rediscovering the same thing, and probably there's probably 2 Roman senators having an argument about this in scrolls about the plague of Justinian.
Thank you so much, David. I need
It's a pleasure.
come back again, because
I love it. But we have to talk about something. We have to talk about something completely different, Abdul. Hopefully, that's what we hope,
Thank
right?
you so much.
We'll talk about the asteroid. That'll be a dark podcast.
Yeah.
Do you think this asteroid's really?
So you have a great Christmas, okay?
You too. Look after you and your family and stay safe. Don't get too worried because, like I said, it does look milder
so much.
and the vaccines work. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.